Welcome to Engaging Cities Fireside Chats. On each episode of the show, I talk to leaders who are paving the way in civic engagement in order to inspire listeners and share strategies that you can implement in your own community. This podcast is proudly supported by our sponsor, Conveo, the engagement platform for plans and policies. Check them out at konveo.com. I'm your host, Kelly Hickler, the community manager with Engaging Cities, as well as the founder of Cinovation Studio, which is dedicated to innovative civic education and engagement. So, one of the cool things about hosting this podcast is that I get to talk to some of the smartest, most outstanding, interesting people who are really leaders and innovators in this field of work. And my guest today is no exception. Dr. Martín Carcasson is a professor at Colorado State University and the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. He is a self-described pracademic, which is an academic who also does extensive practical work in the community. And I love that term, by the way. My conversation with Martín is so relevant right now in a presidential election year, as we're getting closer to Election Day, and we see a lot of polarization, arguing, even outright hatred happening between people who have differing opinions about issues. Martín points out how media, especially social media, is designed to fuel the fire, keep us apart, divide us into factions, because that is how they get viewers and make money. Martín explains the differences between debate, dialogue, and deliberation, and how we can depolarize conversations at the local level so that we're not mirroring the good versus evil, me versus you, red team versus blue team dynamic that plays out in national level political discussions. This conversation is so densely packed with nuggets of wisdom because Martín has such a deep well of knowledge and experience, and he throws out a lot of interesting terms like wicked problems, information disorder, imaginary enemies, and thick versus thin deliberation. If you want to learn what all these terms mean and how to have better conversations with your friends, family, and neighbors, give this episode a listen, or maybe two. I know I'm going to listen to it again because I feel like I learn something new every time. So let's dig in. All right. Well, welcome to the podcast, Martín. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners just a little bit more about yourself and your background? How did you get your start and what it is that you do now?
Yeah. So I'm a communication studies professor at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. I've been here about 20 years. About 18 years ago, I started the Center for Public Deliberation, or the CPD. So it serves as an impartial resource to the Northern Colorado community. I actually, in my classes, train CSU students as facilitators and kind of collaborative problem solving kind of engagement experts. And at this point now, we actually get hired by the city, the county, the school district, the university, community organizations to design and run innovative events to help people have better conversations about tough issues. So my research as a communication professor is always focused on how do we have the tough conversations we need to have for democracy to work. I've always been particularly interested in kind of this tension between democracy and expertise. And see that as the tension that needs to be a tension. If either side kind of dominates too much, we're in trouble, right? And so my early research primarily actually focused on American presidents. I did a lot of research on how presidents talked about complex issues. I published really well. I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, but all my papers were really depressing because they were mainly, I was interested in how do we have high quality conversations about tough issues. And that wasn't happening, right? The issues I cared about were more like political footballs back and forth. So that's why when I finished my PhD 20 years ago, I came to CSU. I shifted from the focus on national to local, and I shifted from being more of a critic and talking about other people's communication to become much more of a practitioner, or a pracademic is one of the words for me. So our research is how do we kind of help people have better conversations? How do we change the conversations, particularly working at the municipal level, to again help people overcome? We'll probably get into this. Overcome some of the unfortunate kind of quirks of human nature that make it really hard to have tough conversations.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lot of tactics that polarize us and outrage us are incentivized because they work pretty well, right? So we're designing processes to try to do the opposite at a local community and build capacity in our local communities, so democracy works better.
Yeah, that is really interesting and much needed work, I would say.
I always
So,
kind of joke that the purpose of my organization is to make itself irrelevant, that people learn how to talk about issues on their own, that they don't need the facilitator. But I probably have, plenty of job security for right now. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so how did you are the founder and the director of the Center for Public Deliberation at Colorado State University.
Yep.
And how did that get started? When did that get started? And what all does that encompass?
Yeah, so it started in 2006. So when I got the job at CSU, the origin story was there was like a list of 10 duties for my faculty position. And number 7 was like, develop some sort of program that gets students involved in local issues, right? It actually came, we used to sponsor the debate team, and that ended before I got here for a variety of reasons we won't get into. But they liked that the debate team would have these public events, right? So I was coming in to kind of take over the argumentation class, one of the core classes we have for our majors. So I first changed the class, kind of got away from such a focus on kind of two-sided debate, which can be useful when done well, right? But often two-sided debate just becomes a spectacle and just becomes, or if
Mhm.
anything, one side's focusing on yes and one on no. No
Yeah.
one's looking for compromise. No one's looking for innovation. No one's looking for
Right.
collaboration, right? So I switched that class from a debate-focused class to a deliberation-focused class, which is a different kind of communication form focused on, hey, how do we make decisions together, right? For me, the basic question of deliberation is, hey, what should we do about X, right? We being an important term, right?
Mm.
Broad, the community comes together. Certainly a role of government, but government is one actor among many. And the X is, hey, what's a shared problem we have that we need to deal with? So for a couple years, I developed that class and kind of played with it in a different way. Students, instead of picking a side and fighting for it, their job was to research the issue, understand the issue, and create a discussion guide, like lay out the options. Like, hey, here are the different paths that we can have. Um, and then the CBD became, okay, so we got all students taking that basic class. This is going to be the advanced class that takes those concepts and applies them to the community. And really at first I thought, I'll have a class maybe once a year. We'll design a discussion guide on a local issue. We'll get a room at the library. Maybe 30 people will show up and we'll have an
Yeah.
interesting conversation. But then I started cold calling like the city and the school district and the League of Women Voters, primarily because I needed their name on a grant application, right? It's like, and just from those calls, they're like, you know what? We're running a meeting in a couple of weeks. You want to help us? So we would help, and it would go well. Then they would ask us back to do something else, and and then every meeting we'd run, 3 or 4 people would walk up afterwards saying, "That was great. Can we do this on this?" So it started taking
Mhm.
off.
Wow.
So we've run over 500 meetings now
Oh
in the
my
last
God.
18 years on all kinds of issues. Again, doing most of the work for city, county, school district, university, community organization.
Okay.
Helped start some community organizations that came out of our meetings. Yeah, and that's the big hopeful message of this. As scary as democracy is right now, right? As
We
polarized and angry as we are, when you give people an alternative, they see the value of it, and they want more of it, right? So it's kind of been this positive feedback loop of a virtuous cycle that the more you do this kind of work, easier it is to do. The more people understand, and you start changing the culture a little bit about how you kind of come together about tough issues.
Yeah. I love that you made that distinction between debate and deliberation. And it's reminding me of this debate that I went to back in college. Gosh, I think it was 2004 or 5. I went to UC Irvine for my undergrad studies, and there was a debate between an atheist and a theist. And I thought, oh, this is gonna be great. This is gonna be so fascinating. But they were the whole time they're just talking past each other. They were
Right.
making
Yeah.
completely different points, and it actually was super disappointing, and
Yeah.
I think I ended up leaving early. But that makes me think of how debates go politically at the national level too, where you have two parties who are talking past each other, not to each other.
Right. Yeah, I'm actually, but my current writing project, and I have like a working doc that I'm showing people, so I can give you that link if others are interested. But I really dig into the distinction between debate, dialogue, and deliberation, and I use a Venn diagram where deliberation's in the middle, and debate and dialogue overlap with deliberation, but not with each other, right? The way I
Okay.
kind of define it,
Okay.
and all three of them I think are really important kind of communication tools that a community needs to have. All three of them don't happen naturally, right? Debate can happen naturally, but mostly bad debate can happen naturally. To get
Yeah.
high quality insight from a debate, you need a really strong moderator, right? And
Yes.
you also need the participants that their goal for the debate is to shed light on the issue, not to win, right, or not to score
Mm,
points. Or even
yes.
worse for political debates, to get a 10-second clip that's going to go viral, right? Because you said so. So
Right.
bad debates mostly just spectacle, mostly kind of preaching to your own choir. A really
Mhm.
high quality debate helps us kind of elevate good information and expose bad information, right? It's really critical right now, right?
Mhm.
One of the biggest I always talk about. There's two big problems I try to deal with. One is polarization, which we can kind of get into if you like,
Mm.
and the other is what some scholars now are calling information disorder. And it's kind of
Oh,
a combination of, part of it is our ability to create information, save information, share information has just exponentially exploded, right?
mhm.
Now we have AI that's creating information all day long, right? Our ability to make sense of information and refine information, and make distinctions between good information and bad information has
Yeah.
not kept up. It's overwhelmed, and then on top of that, you have the misinformation, disinformation amount. So high quality debate can help us with that. It's just
Yeah.
98% of debate is not high quality, right? And then the dialogue, I'll try to do this quick, but dialogue for me is more of it's conversations that are focused on just understanding each other, right? Making some connections. Often in our polarized environment, it's about depolarizing. It's about rehumanizing. It's
Yeah.
hearing each other's stories. But a key aspect for dialogue, at least how I define it, is it's non-judgmental, right? I'm just supposed to listen to your stories. I can't
Mhm.
disagree with you in a dialogue, right? Well, when
Okay.
we're living together in a democracy, we have to make decisions together, right? So dialogue is critical for bringing us together and creating relationships that we really need to have. But dialogue's not a decision-making model, right? So that's where
Mhm.
deliberation. I'm biased. I run the Center for Public Deliberation. It's in the
Mhm.
middle, right?
Mhm.
Because I think at its best, deliberation brings the best of dialogue. It brings the connection. There's lots of things that we do to help people understand each other and overcome polarization and so forth. But it also has a rigorous element. Deliberation is about, hey, we need good information to help us make decisions together. Right? Though to be fair, I'll also say the downside of deliberation is it's very resource heavy. It takes a lot of
Yep.
time to do well. You have to do a lot of work before the meeting. You need to have, for me, deliberations at its best in small groups. So you need lots of different you need a facilitator for every 8 people.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's where my
Wow.
program works
Okay.
is I've got these classes. We've created this great win-win that students are learning this skill set as they're getting class credit while providing the community. Here's 40 trained facilitators that we can
Oh,
show up to
wow.
an event.
Okay.
100 people show up instead of one at a time on the microphone or just sitting there listening to people on a stage, right? We can have 15 different tables with one of my students at every single table, trained generally in conflict management and deliberation, trained specifically on that topic, on that process that was
Mhm.
designed for that issue to help us kind of elevate the conversation and kind of move forward.
So, um, I want to back up for one moment when you're
Yep.
talking about dialogue and deliberation. Would you say that it's necessary? It's a necessary step to start with dialogue. Do you have to have dialogue before you can have deliberation?
In most cases, the issue is if there's a lot of mistrust and misunderstanding. If we, because often, one of the impacts of this hyperpartisan polarization is we have really simple caricatures of the other side, right? There's actually some new
Mhm.
research that I think one of the ways it was framed was imaginary enemies, right? And a lot of the
Hmm.
polarization is based on we hate the other side for things that they don't believe.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So sometimes, so you can't put people together that think that way and say, hey, make a decision together, right? Because no, they can't have
Mm,
the conversation, right? So we
mhm.
might have to do so deliberation inherently involves some dialogic principle, right? So we're doing some things. And if we know, hey, this is an issue that's polarized and people don't understand each other, then we have to lean a little heavier on the dialogue, right? I
Okay.
make the distinction between the three, but they're not completely distinct, right? Any conversation kind of combines elements of all three.
Sure.
So sometimes we have to kind of mend some relationships and create some understanding. Um, and that's also a big part of my research relies on social psychology and brain science, right? How we're wired, and that's part of
Okay.
it. The unfortunate reality is we're much more wired for polarization and outrage than for collaboration and deliberation, right? We
Oh,
want
okay.
simple, right? We
Okay.
love, we're narrative creatures that love the simple good versus evil story. We love our heroes and our victims and our villains. And once we make decisions, our whole brain is wired to defend that decision and find more information. Um, so the easiest way for me to explain my work is like design processes that try to avoid triggering the worst in human nature and actually tap into the best. And the good news about our brains is we're naturally empathetic. We naturally care about others, right? There's this us them kind of relationship that humans are uniquely kind of connected to.
Mhm.
That's incredibly powerful. Uh, we're not individualistic. We are designed to be in teams or tribes or groups, right? The good news, especially in a local community, right? You can tap into that power of us in a very positive way. The bad news is the easiest way to tap into the power of us is to define a them and attack
Okay.
a them, and that's
Okay.
works really well to win elections and to raise money and to get lots of clicks. Um, so that's a big part of my move from national to local, right? National politics, there's two teams. There's a red team and a blue team. It's
Mhm.
inherently triggering the worst of human nature all the time. Creates a zero sum game. Yeah, we're also biased towards negativity, so negative ads are always going to work. We're always going to focus a lot more on negative partisanship, right? We vote more against a party than for it. Getting away from all that in a local
Yes.
community, you can design a very different conversation that taps into the positive aspects of us without having to rely so much on the them to get it to work.
Yes. I have so many follow-up questions as you're talking. I've been writing notes. Um, so imaginary enemies, how have you seen that play out at the local level?
So, but I mean, this goes back a little bit to debate, right? I mean, inherently, a two-party system is going to have a lot of, maybe not an event that's a debate, but just natural debate, which is primarily the incentive is to focus on the upside of your position compared to the downside of the opposing position, right? And since it's winner take all elections, say if I'm on the right, all I have to do is convince the people on the right to vote, and maybe some people in the
Okay.
middle. There's no incentive for me to even talk to people on the left, which is a very bad setup, right?
Mhm.
We incentivize never, really listening to the people you disagree with, right?
Mhm.
Because they're not going to vote for you anyway, right? So that's kind of the problem in a sense of these imaginary enemies, right? Because if I'm listening to a source that I already agree with, which is
Mhm.
what we like to do, right?
Mhm.
We get our news from stations that agree with us, and we have conversation with people. The filter bubbles kind of thing that people talk about. So I have a very exaggerated perspective of the upside of my position and a very
Mhm.
exaggerated of their downside. So that's imaginary enemies, right? If I'm trying to
Mhm.
convince you to vote for me, right?
Mhm.
I'm gonna. It's called nitpicking. I'm gonna pick the worst examples of the other side. Sometimes there might be a kernel of
Mhm.
truth in there. Sometimes it might be made up. It doesn't matter, right?
Okay.
So I create such a caricature, right? Such a false image of the other side. So that's the magic of getting together and having a conversation, particularly with a facilitation. All our events tend to have some sort of discussion guide or backgrounder that helps kind of frame the information and all this kind of art of how do we frame the issue and how do we get people there. So much of that's designed to undo a lot of the damage the broader kind of political communication discourse has done, right?
Okay.
And pat
I
that
see.
ship. So and that's the one of the favorite parts of my job is having conversations with my students afterwards and where people have these aha moments, right? When people just all of a sudden realize that this person across the table isn't nearly as evil as they were convinced they were, right? Like when you actually hear their stories and hear them talk, right? Like, oh, like you sound reasonable, right? I agree with what, I still probably don't change my mind. I still probably think my ideas are better than theirs, but theirs make sense now. And what's happening, if you go back to the upside of my position versus the downside of their position, of course, the other side's doing the opposite, right? We think
Uh-huh.
catty corner. You think like a 2x2
Yes.
box, right? So most political communication in a two-party system, or even just like when there's legislation up, right? And the question is yes, no, right? Um, People are gonna do the catty corner, right? If I'm a yes, I'm gonna look at all the reasons why it's a good policy, right? And
Yes.
against the other. When we have a good conversation, when we have a deliberation, right? We fill in our blind spots. I start recognizing there's a downside to my perspective. There's some
Mhm.
problems here, right? It's not
Mhm.
perfect. There's
Mhm.
no magic bullets, right? Um,
Mhm.
and I start realizing the upside of their perspective.
Mhm.
And it's not that, oh, both of our opinions are just the same. No, it's the more nuanced sense of I have to kind of weigh the balance of the upside versus the downside of mine versus the upside
Yes.
down, and I can recognize, ooh, you have a lot of good ideas, right?
Yes.
Altogether, my ideas are better, right? But and then the magic is once we do that, once we fill out the 2x2 box, right? And I see the upside of both and downside of both, then it might make sense for us to work together. Hey, let's work together to make sure we get the upside, right?
Mm.
I want the upside of both and avoid the downside of both, right?
Mhm.
But most of our politics doesn't reward that. It rewards the opposite. It rewards the imaginary enemies. It rewards the kind of blind spots. So we're trying in a local capacity. How do we build capacity in local communities to have the fuller conversation? And then that has much more. Instead of triggering the worst of human nature, it actually taps into the best, which is we're really creative problem solvers when put in a good situation, right?
Right. Yeah, I could see that playing out in a city council election or maybe a school board election or other local election that kind of mirrors what happens at the national level, where if you're running for an office, you almost have to invent an enemy, an other side to be against. And, I don't know that that I is helpful to our communities.
No, no, it didn't. And,
Yeah.
one quick piece of advice for local communities is like I think most local elections you're not uh, officially defined as a Republican or a Democrat. I think it's a very good thing. Often kind of who's more on what right or left or so forth, right? But the more local communities can do to keep national politics out. It's tough
Mhm.
with school districts. Yeah, school districts are dealing with a lot of culture war issues that are really kind of defined kind of by party position. But for local communities, we had a big uh, issue here with the Gaza uh, situation in Gaza and
Mm,
activists wanting kind of the city of Fort Collins to pass a resolution, right?
okay.
Uh, and my advice was like, no, like that was an international issue, right?
Yeah,
I'm like,
right.
there's not a role here, right? You don't want to bring in those issues because then all that dysfunction at the national level come down. Like, no, we need to focus on the innovative, cool things that are doing in local communities that are bringing people together, and how do we elevate that and size
Yes.
that up versus allowing the national politics into our communities.
Yeah, keep local government local.
Yeah, yeah, which is really hard to do in an election year, right?
Oh, yeah, right,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So, do cities or counties then hire you to come in as basically a consultant, and do you charge a fee to them, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, most of our actual kind of running meetings is going to be here in Northern Colorado, or every once in a while we start up what we call the Democracy Bus, one of the big white vans we can get at CSU. So we've done stuff in Denver and Steamboat and Sterling and so forth, but it's kind of hard with having the students is such a key aspect of it, right? So it's hard for us to do projects, and even generally, it's hard for me to helicopter into another community that doesn't know us, right? They don't
Okay,
see us. We've
okay,
hopefully cultivated a strong reputation for impartiality and being an honest broker of information. So I do a lot of consulting, but it's more training. It's more helping build capacity. One thing
I
I'm really
see.
hoping to do, maybe we check in a couple of years. I got a sabbatical in the spring. I'm both hoping to finish my book, which will be out there. Title right
Okay,
now it's going to be Wicked Problems, Wise Cities. And then we're going to try to build the training arm of the CBD. So I do a lot of individual training, cities, school districts, universities bring me out to do some workshops
I
about
see.
this kind of work. I'm doing a half-day workshop at ICMA this year in Pittsburgh for those that are going to be in ICMA on the Sunday before it starts
Okay.
on problems, which we probably need to get into in a second.
Yep.
Uh, but hopefully we'll actually looking now to really build up, from these 18 years of experience running meetings. Okay, now I'm going to shift a lot of my time to be more training and to create some modules, maybe even create a master's program to kind of create the next generation of public engagement officers that are trained both in like public relations and messaging and
Mhm.
in kind of engagement and deliberative engagement. So we're graduating people that kind of have the full skill set that I think is necessary.
Yeah, that's great. Will that be well, you have to be a Colorado resident to be in that program.
No, I mean, I think I guess we're still saying, I'm assuming I'd like a lot of it to be in person. A
Yeah.
lot of it will be summer workshops. And Fort
Okay.
Collins is a wonderful place to be in the summer. So we are hoping people from all over the world come to Fort Collins to do those trainings so we get them
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
The MA program, I think, will be more in residence, right?
Yeah.
Because then part of it is those students will help with our events, right? So they'll get the practical experience. This kind of work is you can't just learn it in a book, right?
Right, you have to do
It's
it.
called reflective practice. Like you give them some kind of concepts, you give them a chance to practice it or at least observe it, and then you give them a chance to reflect on it and think about it. And we just kind of do that cycle over and over and over again.
Okay.
Uh, but we're excited about kind of building that side of the program.
Okay.
But there are centers like mine across the country,
Yeah.
kind of a growing movement. There's lots more, there's, unprecedented level of polarization and partisanship and animosity. But the counter reaction is certainly already started, right? I'll give
Mhm.
you at least one particular link that you can kind of put on the website.
Yeah, great.
The Listen First Coalition. I
Okay.
like mentioning them because you go to their website and they have the icons for maybe 300 organizations nationally that are doing bridging work, that are doing work focused on bringing people together, of dealing with the polarization. Some of those are national organizations, some national organizations that have local chapters, and then some local organizations, some tied to universities. So a lot of times when I work with cities, I can't bring my students to you to run an event, but I
Yes.
can help you build that capacity. And if you have
Yeah.
a local university, maybe they build a CPD, and I've helped start quite a few CPDs across the country or something like it. Um,
Okay.
but then also you have other cities. The Larimer County here in Fort Collins does that. City of Longmont has been doing that for years, where they have a internal facilitation program. So they have employees across all the departments in the city that committed to be on a facilitation team. They get some training every month, and then they're available to help other departments, right? But I think
Hmm.
overall, especially as you learn um, the how our brains work and how easy it is to trigger the worst, right? You see the value of facilitation, that you need these impartial, trusted facilitators. Cities can
Yes.
build up some of that capacity, but
Yes.
overall, communities need this capacity. So how do you tap into your library, your community foundation? I'm working on a huge project right now called Above the Noise statewide that's helping local newsrooms and radio stations build this capacity. So probably the number one thing for my 18 years is communities need bridging institutions. We have
Yes.
so many institutions that tear us apart, that divide us into small groups. Social media is designed to do that. That's how they make money, right? Media now has switched from broadcasting to narrowcasting. That's how they make money, right? Most activist groups are narrow. We need to recreate and create new bridging organizations that are designed to bring people together and have the skill set to do that well. And you are, seeing more and more of that.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, you mentioned a word, and it's in the title of your upcoming book, Wicked
Yeah.
Problems.
Yeah.
What the heck are those?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a term that's actually been around for more than 50 years now. And it was actually initially developed by civil engineers and kind of city planner types, right? The story, I need to find back where I heard this story because I'm not sure of the source, right? But the story I remember reading is that they were trained as civil engineers, and they got a job with the city. And they figured out pretty quickly that the kind of problems that they were trained to solve and the kind of problems they were asked to solve were quite distinct, right?
Okay.
So they made the distinction between a tame problem, which could be really, really complex, but there is an answer, right? So for a
Okay.
tame problem, you get smart people in the room, you figure out the problem, and then really the only issue is, okay, how do we implement this as well as possible, right? Um,
Okay.
Well, wicked problems don't have a solution, right? Wicked problems inherently involve multiple underlying values that don't fit together very well. Then you're dealing with a public that probably ranks those values differently. So the wicked problems are just really, really messy. And you're never going to solve it. We're never going to figure out housing. We're never going to figure out the perfect way to educate. It's always going to be this tension between these values. So we need to kind of be nimble and kind of think about it, right? But our brain is wired. We want to think one value at a time, right? We want to think, oh, I care about freedom, right? Therefore, if someone disagrees with them, oh, they're against freedom. Our brain loves to we're for something good. Anyone disagrees with me, or to make it simple, our brain prefers to think problems are caused by wicked people with bad values, rather than putting the wickedness in the problem. Now, the broader literature, and Ron Hyphen's work about adaptive problems, type 1, type 2, and 3. Type 3 problems are kind of like wicked problems. A lot of literature, wicked problems is a category or a type of problem. I do it a little bit differently. I like to see it as a lens through which to see problems. And so you can kind of step back, and it's like a tool in your toolkit that you can say, okay, if I look at this as a wicked problem, how might that change the conversation? How might that open up space? So a lot of the work that I do is, I get into a new issue. My job is to figure out, okay, what are all the values relevant to this issue? What are all the things people care about? What are all the underlying interests? Fisher and Urey's book, Getting to Yes, is kind of a famous conflict resolution book. Talks about shifting from positions to interest. That's very relevant as well. What are the underlying interests? When you identify those underlying values and then you put them on the table, and you don't allow people to pick one value at a time, right? One at a time in a microphone on a complex issue, each speaker is like, I care about this value. I care. And they're all talking past each other. No one's working the tension. No one's trying to find the right balance between these, right? So that's where we're trying to shift the conversation. I talk about, we're trying to spark 3 conversations. Long-term, it's the balancing. Okay, how do we find the right balance between all these things that we hold important but don't fit together? Sometimes it's a reconfiguration. Sometimes we really have to shift, like a value has gotten too dominant, or a value's been left behind, or a new value's been introduced. So you can still have a really strong activist perspective within this wicked problems framework, as long as you're recognizing multiple values. Anytime, and this happens on the left and the right, anytime an issue is defined by one value, alarm bells go off. Right? Like, no, that's not a good way to frame it, because it inherently frames one side as getting it right, and one side, we're defining them by what they're against. And that A, doesn't work very well, and B, they're not going to like that. Right? Telling one line I have in my basic talk is, even if the problems are caused by wicked people, which sometimes they are, right? But I think wicked problems happen a lot more often. Telling someone who doesn't think they're wicked that they're wicked doesn't work very well. Doesn't make them less wicked, right? So there's a lot. Some of the issues I deal with are clearly wicked. There's lots of different perspectives and complex. Maybe some other issues, maybe there's some bad faith actors. Maybe there's evidence is much stronger on one side than the other. But I still think pragmatically, the reality is attacking someone in a polarized environment doesn't really work. It just adds to the polarization.
Right.
So reframing the issue as a wicked problem is, I still think, sometimes the best way to move forward, because as we elevate the conversation, things like facts and the quality of the argument matter more, right? When we're screaming at each other, they don't. Facts actually backfire in some scary ways when we're screaming, So that's a basic concept that we use is, okay, how are we framing this issue? How do we engage this issue that inherently kind of works, like I said earlier, to avoid triggering the worst of human nature, to help people ease into the nuance of having a much tougher conversation about these kind of issues.
Okay, I have a few follow-up questions for you. So one would be, can you give an example of a project that you worked on that you've done this facilitation work for? Just to walk through, like maybe it was, I don't know, housing or a particular project for an agency, and how did you navigate that wicked problem conversation? And then the other question is, do you have a framework or something, some resources or tools that you could share with listeners who are not local in Colorado and can't hire you to come help them if they wanted to attempt to try and do this on their own, is there somewhere where they could look for some guidance?
Yeah. So I'll do the second one first.
Okay.
And I'll give you lots of links to a resource page that has lots of articles. The book's not ready yet, but I do have a short article that kind of summarizes the overall arguments that will be extended in the book with lots more examples. I also have a set of 3 videos that kind of walks through kind of the basic talk that I kind of give you a link to that people can kind of dig into some. And then I'll also say, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, ncdd.org, is a great resource that has, lots of different tools, ways of doing things. They have a resource guide that kind of provides a summary and links to just, a lot of different processes, right? And some processes are 2 hours long, some are online, some are some are a couple weeks long, some require a lot of resource. Yeah, so there's a whole toolbox there of how to do public engagement differently. Getting away from, or at least not relying overly on the one at a time of the microphone, which unfortunately is a really bad public process for tough issues, right? For lots of different reasons. Yeah, and then Matt Leininger is doing some really good work for public, the National Civic League and the new kind of Center for Democratic Innovation. He makes a distinction between thick deliberation and thin deliberation. Thick being deliberative engagement. What I do, thin is more like, hey, one time the microphone, a survey, those type of things. So he's got a great textbook kind of on a 21st century kind of public engagement, which it's a really kind of good overview of a lot of these working with Tina Nabachi from Syracuse on there. So yeah, I can give you all those links if people are kind of wanting to dig in. But in terms of an example, maybe the one I'll go with is actually one of our earlier ones that kind of helped introduce ourselves to the community, but it was, in some ways, it was such a textbook case of deliberation that we were helping our local school district try to tell us not too long, but they were looking at changing the grade distribution. So we had K-6 schools, then 3-year junior highs and 3-year high schools, which was very rare, right? Most high schools are 4 years. So normally it's K-5, 3, and 4.
Yeah.
So a new superintendent came in and wanted to move the 6th graders up and the 9th graders up, right? But we're a high-performing district, right? We're in a college town, right? People take education real seriously. So there was very much of a, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mentality, right? And the notion of moving 6th graders to junior high year early was like literally like taking a year of childhood away, right? Because elementary school is a safe place, right? And junior high is hell, right? So all the parents, mainly the parents of 5th graders that were thinking, oh, my 6th grader, instead of going to, having one more year in elementary, is going to junior high. At the same time, all the parents of 8th graders wanted their 9th graders to go to high school, right? So everyone wanted 9th graders in high school, but 6th graders still in elementary school, but no one wanted 2-year junior highs.
Okay.
It's an example of a wicked problem, right? But everyone kind of had their blinders on, right? So the 5th grade parents were looking at their kid, in 9th grade and so forth. So then what typically happens is our brains want simple. And instead of recognizing, oh, yeah, this is complex and there's lots of pros and cons on different sides, the superintendent became the devil figure, right? Oh, he's just coming in and wanting to change, so then there was all this kind of anger kind of directed to him in a sense. So this was our second semester. I had helped the school district with a small meeting. So then they called me in just to kind of like pick my brain about how we do this. By the end of that meeting, we took them over. We ran 7 nights of forums with over like 700 people or so on this issue. But some of the key components, these are the kind of nuts and bolts. How did we frame the issue? We created a discussion guide, right? And this is huge, right? So instead of getting people in a circle and say, hey, what do you think? Right. And just leaving it up to people, we survey people beforehand. I take a lot of time to make sense of the noise. I go to the comments on articles in the newspaper. I go, if there's interest groups in different areas, I go to them. I interview people. Often when people RSVP to one of our events, we'll ask them open-ended questions because I want to get a sense of all the individual opinions before the meeting, right? So then I can summarize. I can fact check some, right? So if there's factual issue, some people are saying X and some people are saying Y, and that's an empirical issue I could check. I can deal with that beforehand, right?
Okay.
But I can also get a sense of all the underlying values, like what are the motivations here? So then I create, it's a special art of creating these discussion guides. Sometimes it's a 11 by 17 piece of paper. We often call it a placemat because it's like waiting for them at the table, right? Sometimes it might be a little 4 or 5 page booklet, something short enough for them to read during the process because we know that they're probably not going to read it beforehand. And we don't want, some of them have read it and some didn't, right? So we try to keep it
Okay.
short. But this becomes this huge kind of aspect of these meetings, right? Because to fill in the blanks, right? For people to see the different sides of it, for people to see their voice in there so they feel heard, which is important.
Mm-hmm.
But then it also gives the facilitator a huge tool to help people understand it. You know, if we're in a regular meeting and you say something I disagree with, I either have to disagree with you, right, and push back, which most people don't like to do. Most people avoid conflict, right? Some
Mm-hmm.
people love conflict, so yeah, they'll jump all over you. That's not great either, right? And a very small percentage of people can deal with conflict well. Well, these discussion guides change that, right? Because you might say, "Ooh, I really like this bullet point here," right? But me pushing back on that is not really pushing back on you, because the way we set up these meetings is the goal of the meeting is help us improve this document, help us refine this, right? And we tell them we didn't get it perfect. We try to summarize the broader conversation. We try to capture what people were talking about and what people care about and lay that in front of you. What we need y'all to do in these small groups is work together to improve this. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you didn't like. Tell us what's missing. Tell us what you think we got wrong. If there's so that it changes the whole nature of the conversation. And like I was saying earlier, instead of like I'm there to fight and defend my perspective, I trigger actually creativity. Like we're now, instead of me against you, right?
Yeah.
It's now we're shoulder to shoulder working this problem together. And we're tapping into kind of human creativity to kind of help that. And it just changes the conversation, right? So that art of creating these discussion guides, a document that was specifically created to spark conversation rather than just provide information or persuade people of something, is a critical document that, I mean, I would say most communication engagement folks were never trained to do that, right?
Right.
Because that's a very
Exactly.
different art than PR, right? So that's where, we need both a traditional PR and we need public engagement, and we need to bring those together. Every city, every county, every school district that has a communication officer or CIO or public affairs manager, right? They need
Yes.
both those skills. So that's the program we're trying to build here that would provide that.
Yeah. I'm thinking, well, so I'm a city planner by trade, and most city planners don't really receive very much, or if any at all, specific
So,
training in facilitating these types of processes.
so,
But you end up being thrown into a role, usually if you're working for a local agency, here, facilitate this meeting. Okay. And you feel like a bit of a deer in a headlights. And I wonder sometimes, I'm interested in your opinion on this, if a staff person can really be, not that they can't be an effective facilitator, not that they're not
yeah.
capable, but in their capacity, their role as a staff person, does it work to have them facilitate the process, or does it work better to have an outside consultant come in and do that facilitation work?
No, it's a great question that we've thought a lot about, right? And I will say generally, um, especially if, because one of the we try to kind of frame these conversations of, what should we do about this issue, with we being the broad community, right? So we don't want the assumption to be city government solves the problem, right? City government is one particularly important tool that helps us solve problems, right? So
Mhm.
that's why if the city is the convener and the city's the facilitator, sometimes too much of the conversation is what should the city do, right?
Mhm.
Versus what should the community do. So that's one concern, right?
Mhm. Okay.
And if it is about what should the city do, how can the person that works for the city be the impartial facilitator, right? That kind of seems odd, right? Now, for some of these programs like Longmont and Larimer County, like I mentioned, that they have this facilitation core, right? Well, what will happen is, okay, they have environmental services is having an event. Well, they can pull someone from other places, right? So it's a city employee, but they're not working in that area. That helps a little bit, right?
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, when I started my program, I primarily, tied to students because that's most of my job, right? Most of my job's teaching, so I had to like, hey, I want one of my courses every semester to find it. I thought I'd be pretty limited on what topics can we do. Like, will they take these students seriously?
Yeah.
It's worked better than I ever imagined. Right.
Okay.
Partly because, students aren't seen to have, big, strong opinions on these city issues, right?
Yeah.
And they're not known, right? So it's
Yeah.
that win-win that, that they're getting class credit, they're getting great experience. So they get what they need. So that's one way to kind of build it, but that's kind of the hardest nut to crack sometimes for other cities is,
Mhm.
to do this deliberative engagement stuff, you need kind of a core of facilitators and where
Mhm.
you get, right?
Mhm.
That can either be really, really expensive as you're always
Mhm.
hiring it out, or
Yes.
you have to build internal capacity,
Yeah.
or I think, with school districts, I've seen some success of volunteers, right? Parents that are passionate about the school district that they might be willing to kind of play that role. Or do you connect to a local, university or community college?
Mhm.
We've trained high school kids, and part of the reality of facilitation, especially the small group facilitation, uh, to give them enough skills to make a positive impact in the conversation,
Mhm.
uh, I just need an hour, right? It's a very low bar to be a decent enough facilitator that you're a net positive, right?
Okay.
To be a really good facilitator that's always making the right decision and always finding the right balance between that's really, really hard, right? And it's weird.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks I'm a master facilitator. I train facilitators all the time. I rarely get to facilitate because my students are always doing that, right? I'm always in the front of the room, right? But I think even, you can kind of train high school students to do this and be a resource in some ways, right?
Oh, wow. I
Got a
I
car
haven't.
alarm going off, but
It's okay. I don't think I can hear it.
okay.
No, you're fine.
Hopefully you can't hear that.
Yeah, I had kids screaming outside my window
One
earlier.
quick thing
Yeah.
to finish the story on the school district, right? So we created this discussion guide with here's some 3 options of how we might think about reconfiguration. Here are the pros and cons and so forth. So that was the discussion guide that I was kind of mentioning. But the very first night we're running an event, we had like 4 or 5 different classrooms full, and I'm outside the classrooms talking to the superintendent. And the principal of that school walks out of one of the rooms that he'd been observing, the really kind of odd look on his face, and walks up to us. Like, what's wrong? What happened? He's like, I've never seen that before. I'm like, what? He's like, well, this woman was just really angry, just, ridiculous notion of moving 6th graders to junior high already, and just kind of going off. Well, then a parent on the other side of the table said, well, I got an 8th grader, right? And next year counts for college. My middle school doesn't have the classes that he needs to take. My kid needs to be in high school. And
Mm.
the first mother went, oh, I never thought of it that way, right? And and that's what sparked, like, he had never seen someone change their mind during a public process, right?
Oh, wow.
Because if
Yeah.
you rely on one at a time with a microphone, right?
Mhm.
And if another kind of hint I always give to city leaders is, if the big meeting is about a yes or no issue, it's probably going to go badly, right? Because people are walking in, they've already answered yes or no, right? So they're
Mhm.
there, they're not there to think, they're not there to, get creative or to collaboration or
Yeah.
to listen. They're there to
Yeah.
win. They're there to protect their position, right? So it's going to
Yeah.
be a bad conversation, right? So we always try to back up, like, hey, no, let's, because the best of human nature is we're really creative problem solvers. So focus it around the problem, and then have lots of different options for solutions. And
Yeah.
also part of the process is coming up with new options we haven't thought of about, right? To tap into. When you can tap into your public as creative problem solvers, that's when
Mhm.
the public's a resource rather than just a problem to kind of manage, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so we saw, and then the very end of that story, they did decide to make the change. There was a lot of pushback. I think it was like a 7-2 vote on the board, and I still get goosebumps telling this part of the story. Is 20 years ago or 18 years ago. Uh, right after they voted, the first person is, the school board member presses the light on their microphone to show that they want to speak. So right after the vote, the person who'd been against it from the very beginning, one of the persons that vote no, press that red button, and I'm like, oh boy, what? And he's like, okay, everyone knows I've been against this from the beginning, right? And it was more just if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of thing, right? Why
Okay.
rock the boat? He's like,
Okay.
but we had a good process. We went through this all. We've made the decision. Now it's my job to make sure this works. And I remember just being so surprised and floored by that, but then also
Mhm.
realizing that's the way it should be, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But the problem is when you don't have a legitimate process, right? When it's
Mhm.
just, collecting votes and winning,
Yeah.
um, maybe you have a majority on council so you can push something through. The losers, the people that disagree with it, right, instead of
Yes.
feeling heard, are now angry and are more
Yes.
polarized. And then they're going to put all their energy either into undoing this, right, or
Mhm.
recalling the election or getting them out next time, or
Yes.
even worse, I'm going to make the implementation as possible as I can. Right? And those are all bad options, right? But when
Mhm.
you have a high quality deliberative process, you really walk your community through this, and and they have the full, right? They see the upside and the downside of both things, right? They might be disappointed, right? They might, I don't know, my side was better than that side, but they know reasonable people care about the other side, that there was good reasons. They felt they were heard. People heard my concerns, right? So then
Mm.
they're much more likely to say, okay, yeah, let's see if we can make this work, right? And that's kind of the mantra of facilitators everywhere, right? Facilitation takes a long time, right?
Mhm.
Um, but you have to go slow to go fast. And if you have a really good process to make a tough decision, and there's trust in that decision, and there's buy-in and there's ownership of that decision, then the implementation is going to work a lot better versus passing something and then it gets unpassed and then passed again and then
Right.
and we just kind of keep on
Yes.
going up this loop, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm thinking through so many different cities, public engagement process when it comes to development projects, for example, where there's usually some requirement to have
Yeah.
a community meeting. Developers proposing a new apartment complex, let's say, and there's a requirement to have a community meeting. And those meetings usually don't go super well, especially if there's
Yeah.
a portion of the community who doesn't want more housing at all, doesn't want apartments, whatever. Then it becomes this me versus you, good versus evil discussion. And it's unfortunately built into the process a lot of times. Like it's in the development code of you shall
Right.
do this. And I think, oh, there's got to be a better way to go about doing
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. And I should admit here that the wicked problems deliberative perspective we use doesn't work for every single issue, right? I think it's a severely underused tool, but it's not
Mhm.
the right tool for all. Especially it works best when kind of everyone agrees it's a problem. uh,
Mm.
we might disagree on why it's a problem, certainly disagree on what we should do about it, right? But there's a lot of common ground in the sense of, hey, we need to take on this challenge, or maybe there's either common ground on a problem or common ground on a vision, right? Hey, we want to
Mm.
reach this.
Yeah.
Um, if there's a significant portion of the community that's really happy with the status quo,
Mhm.
uh, and then it's a little bit tougher for this to kind of work, right? And
Mhm.
that those kind of situations, right? Hey, no, I like my community the way it is, right? I don't want changes, or even we're doing a lot of stuff of trying to kind of spark more affordable housing, right? And a
Yeah.
lot of those things, people that have a single family home now, the system's
Mhm.
really working for them, right?
Mhm.
So you're having to figure out a different way to change that conversation, and we've struggled a lot with having
Mm.
a really good conversation. I've written some, not published yet, but trying to work through of looking at affordable housing. It's almost like a super wicked problem, right? It's got some additional elements in a sense to it that it's trying to find the right adjective to kind of fit that. But yeah, and one of the biggest problems with those kind of development meetings, right, is it gives the impression sometimes like if I'm putting in a new development and I'm doing everything according to code, I'm doing everything what's allowed. But then, and we do require in Fort Collins, we try to get rid of that, and then it didn't work. That it triggers an automatic meeting, right? It gives the
Mhm.
impression to the neighbors that if you show up angry enough, you can stop this, right? Which is
Right.
which is not really true, right?
Right.
If they're if they're doing everything so I think it's almost kind of giving a meeting a false pretense, right? And
Mm.
you see that in the emails and the flyers and so forth. Hey, show up at this meeting, right? And and this idea if we all rise up against it, and that's a good example of bringing out the worst in human nature, right? Um,
Exactly.
so yeah, thinking about how we can do those meetings differently, I think can be important.
Yeah. Do you have any initial ideas on that?
Huh? Part of it is similar in a way, like with school districts when they have to do like shifting the boundaries of who goes to what schools and so forth, right? Those are the other issues that I'm like, I don't think my process works for that because it's when there's just clear winners and losers, right? It's just really hard to frame it. I always want to try to frame it, and again, like most issues I can, right? figure out a way to frame it as hey, here's a common problem we're working together to tap into kind of the best of human nature. But when there's kind of clear winners and losers, those are,
Mm,
I think there's still certain elements that you can do to kind of do it better, that not fall into it. The other problem with when the meeting is all based on a yes and no, and we actually
mhm.
got this with the grade configuration, uh, it's the people that show up to the meeting are much more likely to be in the no's, right?
Right,
It's human
yes.
psychology, right? If I see something in the newspaper about the school district or the city doing something and I like it, right? My reaction is, "Ooh, that's a good idea," and I move on with my day.
Right.
If I don't like it, I'm like, "Oh, hell no," and I show up, right? So that's the other problem is it really oversamples the
Okay.
opposition to anything,
Mhm,
and the people that are for it don't tend to show up, right? So
mhm,
that's the other kind of how do we reframe this and do it in a different way? Right.
mhm.
And part of it, we're actually going to be experimenting with a citizens assembly here in Fort Collins. Actually, I think we have the vote tonight for the second
Okay.
reading of allocating some funding for a citizens assembly. I don't know if y'all are
Oh,
familiar with those. But
okay.
almost it's kind of like a citizen jury. You're creating through sortition, through a random sample, you create a jury that's going to spend a significant amount of time to kind of go through the issue and make a recommendation. It's kind of like a task force, but has
Okay,
some
I see.
specific kind of techniques to it. So you're not doing a task force that you're trying to get each interest represented. It's more of a random sample,
Okay.
which for some good reasons kind of can work a lot. It's just everyday citizens that are willing to they're getting a stipend to spend some significant time and kind of work through the issue instead of the
Okay.
dominant voices always being the ones that have their mind made up before it even starts. Right?
And is that in regards to a specific topic, or do they
Yeah, I
come
think what we're
together?
gonna
Oh,
do, there's a national organization, so Healthy Democracy is kind of one of them, and they're working to so citizen assemblies have been kind of people Google it, you'll see that they've been popping around and starting in different places. Europe uses these quite a bit, and we're seeing more and more in the states. But they're often kind of one-off procedures, right? So there's some interest on kind of getting a city to do like, hey, one a year for 3 years or something like that. So it looks like Fort Collins might be. So the
mm,
first topic, we actually have some land that there's some controversy what to do to the land. CSU had their football stadium on there, and then they built a new stadium on campus. Uh,
mhm,
and a resolution was actually passed for the city to buy it from CSU. So now we have the land, and do we build housing on that? Do we, so there's
mm.
lots of different options, and there's some
Okay.
controversy with that. So they're thinking that might be the first issue that they use the citizens assembly to really kind of dig in and see what they can figure out what would be best to use that land for.
Okay, I'll be curious to see how that
Yeah,
turns out in Fort
yeah.
Collins. All right, we've covered a lot of topics. I feel my brain feels saturated with things to think about and to look up further. I know you mentioned the Above the Noise project that you're working on, and I think that could be an interesting follow-up conversation if you're willing to come back on our podcast.
Yeah.
And something else I know that you're working on is the Deliberative Journalism Project. I don't know if you want to briefly mention that, and
Yeah,
that
so
could
that's
be a follow-up conversation too. But
yeah,
let's introduce the idea.
the quick about 3 years ago, we started the Deliberative Journalism Project, or the DJP. So that's a collaboration between the CPD, the journalism department here at CSU, political science honors, the languages department, and then local newsrooms. And the public library is now on it. League of Women Voters is on it. So it's a collaboration focused on kind of just recognizing the importance of quality local news to democracy, and then it kind of experimenting. So in a few different ways. So part of this is infusing local democracy with more deliberative principles, right? Yeah, there's always been some in there, right? But
Mhm.
taking the lessons we learned from running 800 meetings and how does that get incorporated in how a newspaper talks about an issue, right? But then also so Above the Noise is now taking that national, right? So Deliberative Journalism Project about Northern Colorado, with us kind of experimenting here.
Mhm.
And Above the Noise is working with Rocky Mountain Public Media, the Colorado Press Association, Colorado Media Project, and the CPD to equip local newsrooms with deliberative capacity. And for that, it's actually a lot of these are smaller towns. It's for them to actually be the convener, for them to actually run meetings. They want to engage their community and rethink that. So part of it's infusing journalism with deliberation. Part of it is having newsrooms do more traditional deliberation. And then part of it is deliberating about journalism. Part of it is, hey, having a conversation. Journalism's in crisis. We're losing newspapers every day. We've lost 4 in Colorado in the last 2 weeks in some of the eastern Colorado kind of towns. Local journalism cannot survive as a market good anymore, right? The advertising dollars have gone to Google and Facebook, and people don't want to pay for subscriptions because they get so much free information everywhere else, right? So, but local communities need their news. So how do we rethink how news works? Part of that is news shifting from market to nonprofit. Part of that is the role of philanthropy. Part of, so we've created a discussion guide. I can give you this link if you want to see what these discussion guides look like.
Yeah, sure.
Or a community to have a conversation. Like, hey, how do we reimagine local journalism so that our community gets what they need, but also the newsroom gets what they need to survive, right? To keep on. I think we need professional journalists, right? Like I said earlier, right? That high quality local newsrooms can be these bridging institutions, can be these trusted impartial resources that help us come together, that help deal with information disorder, that help deal with polarization. And we're losing more and more. We're either losing them or they're shrinking like crazy. They don't have time to do the work well. So how do we rethink that?
Time or the budget, probably.
Yep.
Okay. Well, Martin, thank you so much for talking to our listeners on the podcast today. And where can people follow you or get in touch with you if they have follow-up questions?
Yeah, so I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. And luckily I have one of those names that there's not too many other Martín Carcassons in the world. So if you just search for my name, you'll find it, or I'll give you the link to it. The CBD is just cbd.colostate.edu. So it's Colorado State University. So it's colostate.edu. So you can go to that website. It's got some, resource links there to articles, or just email me. So if you email me, I'll provide the email. You'll find it's not hard to get me talking about this stuff, and I'm happy. I write because I want people reading my stuff. A lot of my stuff is not in academic journals. I do it, National Civic Review and so forth, and I have different essays that my audience typically is city leaders and city managers and local elected officials and so forth. So happy to share a lot of the articles that dig into all these different kind of things.
Okay, great.
I'll also say I just did an hour-long session for Above the Noise that was recorded, digging into polarization for an hour. Why we're polarized, what's the impact, how do we change it? That I'll share that link as well if people want to hear me talk a little bit longer.
Yeah, I'll definitely add that to our podcast description. So thank you again. Thank you so much. It was really enlightening hearing you talk through all these topics, and hopefully we'll have you back on a future episode.
All right. Maybe I'll have my book next time so I can.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect. All right.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kelly.
All right. As always, thank you, listeners, for tuning in, and thanks again to our generous sponsor, Conveo. Head on over to engagingcities.org, where you can find additional episodes and other helpful resources related to community engagement. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.